My daughter-in-law shoved my wife into the mud 20 minutes after saying her vows. I saw it happen. Not the way Brianna later described it. Not the version her bridesmaids repeated over champagne, where Helen supposedly lost her balance on the wet garden path after having too much wine. I saw Brianna's hand close around my wife's arm. I saw Helen pull back. And I saw Brianna give one hard, deliberate push. Helen went sideways off the stone walkway behind the Ashford Ridge estate outside Nashville, her heel catching the edge before she disappeared into a flower bed soaked from an afternoon storm. For half a second, nobody moved. Then somebody laughed. That sound has stayed with me longer than the image of Helen falling. I was across the terrace talking to two longtime clients when I heard the gasp. By the time I reached her, my wife of 38 years was sitting in black mud, one hand braced against the ground, her pale blue mother of the groom dress ruined from hip to ankle. Brianna stood above her in a white reception gown that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. "Oh my God," she said, covering her mouth. But she wasn't shocked. She was watching the guests. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm so sorry. I thought you were stepping back." Helen looked at her. That was all. No screaming. No accusation. Just a stare I knew well enough to understand. Helen was scared. I crouched beside her. "You hurt?" "My shoulder." I helped her stand. Mud dripped from her sleeve. A few members of Brianna's family had gathered near the path. Her father, Charles Mercer, stood beneath the string lights with a bourbon glass in one hand. He looked at Helen's dress. Then at me. "Terrible weather for an outdoor wedding," he said. Two men beside him chuckled. I felt something in me go cold. Not hot. Cold. I'd spent 40 years in commercial construction. I'd been screamed at by developers, threatened by subcontractors, sued by people whose mistakes I'd paid to fix, and once stood in front of a concrete supplier who tried to bankrupt my company because I wouldn't approve fraudulent invoices. Anger had cost me money before. Patience had made me wealthy. So I didn't hit Charles. I didn't yell at Brianna. I took off my jacket, wrapped it around Helen's shoulders, and started walking her toward the building. That was when Luke came running. My son looked terrified. Not because his mother had been hurt. Because people were staring. "Dad, what happened?" Helen opened her mouth. Brianna answered first. She slipped. Luke turned toward her. She slipped. I tried to catch her. Helen's fingers tightened around my forearm. I looked down. One of her pearl earrings was missing. They'd been a gift from me on our 20th anniversary. "Robert," she whispered. "Later." Luke lowered his voice. "Mom, were you drinking?" Helen stared at him like he had slapped her. "I had half a glass of champagne." "I'm not accusing you. You just did." Brianna moved closer to Luke and touched his chest. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." I looked at her. Afraid of what? She swallowed. That something would happen and somehow I'd get blamed. There it was. Not an apology. A defense prepared before anyone had even accused her. I didn't understand how important that would become until later. Luke rubbed both hands over his face. "Can we please not do this tonight?" Helen's voice shook. "Your wife pushed me." Luke froze. Brianna gave a small, wounded laugh. "Are you serious?" "I know what happened." Several guests had started pretending not to listen. Luke glanced toward the reception ballroom, where nearly 300 people were waiting for the father-son toast. "Mom, the path is wet." She grabbed my arm. "She tried to stop you from falling." "No. Please." That one word wasn't directed at Brianna. It was directed at Helen. Please stop talking. Please protect my wedding. Please swallow what happened so I don't have to choose between my mother and my wife. I'd heard versions of that plea from Luke his whole life. When he wrecked his first truck at 17, I paid for the repairs before he could tell his mother. When his business idea failed at 26, I quietly covered $80,000 in losses. When he joined Callahan Commercial Builders, I gave him a vice president title sooner than our board thought he was ready. Every time Luke ran into a wall, I moved the wall. And standing there with Helen covered in mud, I realized I had trained my son to believe consequences were negotiable. I put my hand on his shoulder. We're leaving the reception for a while. His face changed. Dad, you're supposed to give the toast. I know. You can't walk out. I'm taking your mother inside. Brianna muttered, of course. Helen heard her. So did I. Luke did too. He pretended he hadn't. That wasn't the first time Brianna had treated us that way. For 6 months, she had been asking questions about our property outside Franklin. 42 acres my father had bought when the surrounding land was mostly pasture. Today, developers valued it at nearly $4.8 million. Does the company own it? Brianna had once asked over dinner, or do you and Helen own it personally? I remember laughing. Why? Just curious what Luke will eventually be responsible for. Luke had looked embarrassed. Bri. What? Families should talk about these things. Charles Mercer had smiled across the table. She's always thinking ahead. Back then, I considered it tacky. Now I wasn't so sure. 3 weeks before the wedding, Helen told me she had walked into my home office and found Brianna holding her phone over my desk. Brianna claimed she had been photographing the wedding seating chart. There really was a seating chart there. What Helen didn't mention until later was what had been sitting underneath it. My succession binder. The draft outlining how I planned to transfer leadership of Callahan Commercial Builders to Luke over the next 2 years. I had dismissed the incident because Luke was already included in the plan. Why would Brianna need to steal something meant to benefit her husband? That question had bothered me. But not enough. Then Charles started making strange comments. At a golf lunch in June, I explained that I wasn't ready to partner with Mercer Development on his proposed mixed-use project. He had leaned back and said, well, you can't delay decisions forever. Not when your internal approvals only give you 72 hours on certain asset votes. I remember setting down my fork. Where'd you hear that? He smiled. Luke mentioned something similar. I asked Luke later. He denied it. I believed him. That was mistake number 2. Inside the bridal suite, a venue medic cleaned the scrape on Helen's elbow and examined a red mark behind her right ear. Probably caught something when you fell, he said. Helen touched the spot. Her face tightened. I crouched beside her chair. What happened before you went outside? She looked toward the closed door. Robert, I heard something. My stomach tightened. What? Brianna and Charles were arguing near the library. About what? I didn't hear everything. Helen's voice dropped. But I heard Brianna say, once Luke has the votes, they can't stop us. I said nothing. She continued. I asked her what she meant. And she followed me outside. Helen looked down at the mud on her dress. She wanted to know how much I heard. The door opened before I could answer. Luke stepped inside. Brianna was behind him. My son looked exhausted. Dad, everybody's waiting. Helen stood slowly. I'm not going back out there. Luke shut his eyes. Mom. No. Brianna crossed her arms. She's trying to punish us. That did it. Helen turned. This is not about your wedding. Everything today has been about making me uncomfortable. Helen stared at her. You asked me whether Robert could transfer the Franklin land without my signature. Brianna's expression flickered. Just once. Luke frowned. What? She asked me last month. I was making conversation. You asked 3 times. Because nobody ever tells Luke anything about the company he's supposedly going to inherit. There was the word. Inherit. I had never promised Luke ownership by inheritance. I had promised him the chance to earn control. Those were very different things. Brianna continued. Charles respects Luke enough to treat him like an adult. I looked at her. And what exactly has Charles been telling him? Luke stepped between us. Stop. His voice cracked louder than I had ever heard it. Everybody just stop. Then he looked at me. Dad, you promised things would change after the wedding. I promised we would review the succession timeline. You said I'd have real authority. You will. When? Brianna watched him from behind. Not angrily. Carefully. Like someone observing whether a button she had spent months pressing would finally work. Luke reached inside his jacket. For one strange second, I thought he was checking his phone. Instead, his fingers brushed a dark leather folder. Charles's wedding gift. I had seen him give it to Luke before the ceremony. Inside was an expensive fountain pen engraved with Luke's initials. On the folder itself, embossed beneath the clasp, were 5 words. Build your own legacy. At the time, it seemed pretentious. Now it felt like an instruction. Luke lowered his hand. Can we talk Monday? Yes. About the transfer? Yes. His shoulders loosened. Brianna smiled. Helen looked at me. She knew me well enough to know I hadn't agreed to anything. We left through a side entrance 40 minutes later. I put Helen in the passenger seat, then told her I needed a minute. I walked across the gravel parking lot until the music from the reception became a distant pulse. Then I called Melissa Grant, my attorney of 19 years. She answered on the 4th ring. Robert? Everything okay? No. What happened? I looked back toward the venue. Through the windows, I could see Luke and Brianna moving across the dance floor while guests surrounded them. Don't file anything, I said. Don't contact Luke. And don't call the board. There was a pause. Okay. I need you to pull every version of my succession agreement. Why? Because Charles Mercer knows details he was never supposed to know. Another pause. This one longer. I'll check first thing in the morning. Check tonight. I hung up. Helen was silent on the ride home. At one red light, she touched her bare earlobe. I'm sorry about the pearl, she said. I looked at her. You're apologizing for an earring? It mattered to me. We'll find it. I thought I was talking about the pearl. I wasn't. At 7:12 the next morning, my phone rang. Melissa. I answered before the second ring. What did you find? Her voice was different. Controlled. Professional. Scared. Robert, I compared the copy Luke has been using with the version you approved. I sat up in bed. And? Most of it is identical. Most? One paragraph isn't. Helen opened her eyes beside me. I put the phone on speaker. Melissa continued. The revised version expands Luke's authority to approve financing secured by company-controlled real estate. My mouth went dry. That language was never in my draft. I know. Who changed it? I don't know yet. Then Melissa said the sentence that turned my son's wedding from a family humiliation into something much more dangerous. Robert, someone changed your succession agreement. Melissa came to the house before 9 that morning with 2 binders, her laptop, and the expression of someone who had already found more than she wanted to tell me over the phone. Helen was at the kitchen table in one of my old sweatshirts, her bruised shoulder wrapped in an ice pack. The ruined wedding dress was hanging over a chair in the laundry room. I had slept maybe 90 minutes. Melissa placed both binders on the table. This is your original succession draft. She tapped the first one. This is the version Luke sent me Thursday, saying he wanted it ready for discussion after the honeymoon. I looked at her. He sent you that before the wedding? Thursday afternoon. Helen slowly lowered the ice pack. What exactly changed? Melissa opened both documents to the same section. My original agreement gave Luke increasing operational authority over 2 years, while major borrowing, real estate transfers, and company-backed financing still required my approval and the consent of our board. Luke's version looked almost identical. Almost. One paragraph had been rewritten so that once Luke received 41% voting control, certain financing decisions could be approved by a board majority without my personal consent. That alone was aggressive. The next sentence was worse. Company-controlled real estate could be pledged as security in a development partnership. Helen looked at me. The Franklin land isn't company-controlled. No. Then why does it matter? Melissa answered. Because Robert has discussed contributing that property to the company as part of his estate and retirement planning. I looked at her sharply. Discussed. Never approved. I know. Helen went still. And who knows that? The answer bothered me. Very few people. Me. Helen. Melissa. My CFO, Garrett Nolan. And Luke. Melissa folded her hands. If Robert transfers the Franklin parcel into the company, and Luke gains enough voting control under this document, he could potentially use that land in financing without Robert's direct approval. Helen whispered, Charles. I didn't say anything. But I saw the same thing she did. The land. Brianna's questions. Charles's development proposal. The changed paragraph. And Charles somehow knowing about our 72-hour approval clause months before Luke presented this version. None of it felt separate anymore. At 10:17, Luke called. I let it ring twice before answering. Morning. His voice was flat. You left without saying goodbye. Your mother was injured. She wasn't injured, Dad. She got muddy. I looked at Helen across the table. Her face changed, but she said nothing. Her shoulder is bruised. Luke sighed. Can we not start this again? You called me. Because we need to talk about Monday. You're on your honeymoon. We delayed leaving until tomorrow. Of course they had. Why? Silence. Then he said, I want the succession agreement signed before we go. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was too fast. You got married yesterday. And you promised we would settle this. I promised we'd review it. We've reviewed it for months. Not the version you sent Melissa. That stopped him. What does that mean? You know what it means. Another pause. Then Luke said, quieter, Brianna helped me clean up some language. I stood. Brianna rewrote my succession agreement. She didn't rewrite it. You just said she changed the language. She pointed out places where I didn't have enough independence. Helen closed her eyes. There was the answer. Not all of it. But enough. Who gave her the document? I did. Why? Because she's my wife. And she gave it to her father. I didn't say that. No, you didn't. His voice hardened. You're doing exactly what she said you'd do. What's that? Look for an excuse to pull back the moment I'm about to have real authority. I stared out the kitchen window. For years, Luke had accused me of helping him too much. Now he was accusing me of controlling him because I wouldn't hand him voting power on demand. Monday, I said. My office. 9 o'clock. Then I hung up. Melissa looked at me. He admitted Brianna saw the draft. Yes. That matters. It matters more if Charles saw it. By Monday morning, Luke was already sitting in my conference room when I arrived. Brianna was with him. So was Charles. That told me more than anything they could have said. Charles stood and gave me the same warm handshake he always used before asking for something expensive. Robert. Difficult weekend. I ignored him. Luke, I asked to meet with you. He's here to help. I didn't ask for help. Luke pushed a document across the table. We're wasting time. I sat. What is this? The final version. There is no final version. His jaw tightened. Dad. No. One word. That was all it took. His face turned red. For the next 20 minutes, Luke accused me of moving the goalposts, delaying retirement, embarrassing him in front of his new family, and treating him like an employee instead of a successor. Charles barely spoke. That was deliberate. He let Luke do the fighting. Then, when my son was angry enough, Charles leaned back. Robert, perhaps the issue is trust. I turned toward him. You think? He smiled faintly. Luke is 32. He's helped grow this company. At some point, a father has to decide whether his son is truly capable. And if I decide he is, then give him the authority to prove it. Brianna added, unless you never intended to. I looked at Luke. He was watching me. Waiting. Years of resentment had been condensed into one question. Do you believe in me? And for the first time, I understood how Charles was using it. I closed the document. I'm not signing this. Luke stood so quickly his chair hit the wall. Then I quit. Nobody spoke. I thought it was another threat. It wasn't. He took his company access card from his wallet and dropped it on the table. I've already spoken to Cunningham Retail and Bexley Medical. My stomach tightened. Both were clients with projects scheduled for the next quarter. What did you say to them? That I'm starting my own firm. Helen, who had been silent at the end of the table, whispered, Luke. He didn't look at her. Charles finally spoke. Mercer Development is prepared to provide initial backing. There it was. Not a family dispute. A competing company. My son had planned this before walking into the room. How long? I asked. Luke frowned. How long what? How long have you been preparing to leave? He hesitated. Brianna answered for him. Long enough to know he deserves better. Helen stood. You've been planning this? Luke looked at her. This has nothing to do with you. She laughed once. A broken sound. Your wife shoved me into the mud 2 days ago, and now you're leaving your father's company with her father's money. But it has nothing to do with me. Brianna rolled her eyes. Oh my God. Helen turned toward her. Don't. Luke stepped forward. Mom, this is why everything keeps getting worse. The room went quiet. Helen blinked. What did you say? You won't let the wedding thing go. I saw her face collapse before she could hide it. You think I caused this? I think you turned an accident into a war. That hurt her more than the fall. I knew because Helen didn't answer. She simply picked up her purse and walked out. I followed her into the hall. She made it as far as my office before the tears came. I told the truth, she whispered. I know. He thinks I did this. I know. All I did was tell him what happened. I pulled her against me. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped thinking about Callahan Commercial Builders. The company could lose 2 clients and survive. We could lose 10 and survive. What I couldn't tolerate was watching my wife be punished for refusing to lie. That was the moment something in me changed. Until then, I had still been trying to save Luke from Charles. After that, I wasn't sure Luke wanted saving. The next 48 hours were ugly. Rumors spread through the company that Luke was launching Mercer Callahan Development. 3 project managers asked whether I was retiring. 2 senior estimators requested private meetings. 1 subcontractor called me directly and said Charles had been telling people that Luke would control Callahan Commercial Builders before the end of the year. That was impossible now. Which meant Charles had been saying it before the wedding. Melissa and Garrett Nolan began reviewing everything they could legally access. By Wednesday evening, Garrett walked into my office carrying a stack of public financing records. You need to see this. He closed the door. Mercer Development is in trouble. How much trouble? Potentially fatal. Charles's luxury project north of Murfreesboro had missed 2 financing milestones. A lender had filed notices against multiple Mercer-controlled entities. Garrett estimated Charles needed a major new capital source or asset-backed partnership within months. What about the mixed-use project beside our Franklin property? Garrett gave me a grim smile. That's probably his escape hatch. I leaned back. Suddenly the pressure made sense. Charles didn't merely want my land because it was valuable. He needed it because it could rescue him. That night, Helen and I went through every conversation we could remember. The land questions. The office photograph. The leather folder. Charles pushing Luke to build his own legacy. Then Helen stopped. What? She stared at me. At dinner in June. What about it? When Charles talked about the approval window. I nodded. The 72-hour clause. No, Robert. She leaned toward me. You said Luke denied telling him. He did. Then how did Charles know? I looked at her. She continued slowly. Brianna photographed that seating chart beside your succession binder before the wedding. My pulse changed. And Charles referenced the confidential clause before Luke ever showed us the altered agreement. The room went silent. I finally understood what Helen was saying. The shove into the mud hadn't started this. It was part of it. Brianna had panicked because Helen overheard the wrong conversation. Charles had known confidential details long before he was supposed to. And Luke had just admitted giving Brianna access to the document. I picked up my phone. Helen asked, "Who are you calling?" "Melissa." "What are you going to tell her?" I looked down at the 2 versions of the agreement lying on my desk. Not to treat this like a family fight anymore. Because for the first time, I could see the shape of the whole thing. The wedding. The land. The altered document. Luke's resignation. Charles's debt. They weren't separate problems. They were one plan. The next morning, I stopped trying to prove Charles Mercer was manipulating my son. I started trying to prove exactly how. There was a difference. Emotion wanted confrontation. Evidence wanted patience. Melissa understood that immediately. She sat across from me in my office with Garrett beside her and said, "If Charles has had access to confidential company documents, we need a timeline before we make accusations. So we build one." Garrett opened his laptop. We already started. The document system showed every time a succession draft had been downloaded, edited, or forwarded from a company account. There were no mysterious outside logins. No hacked passwords. No anonymous user. The uncomfortable answer was much simpler. Luke had downloaded the original succession draft 4 months before the wedding. At 10:43 on a Thursday night. I remembered that night. He had called me the next morning asking whether I ever planned to let him negotiate bank financing without me. At the time, I thought he was frustrated. Now I wondered who had been sitting beside him when he asked. Melissa pointed to another entry. "This is the problem." "What?" The document was downloaded to Luke's laptop, but 3 days later someone printed it from his home printer through the company remote system. Garrett looked at me. Could have been Luke. Could have been Brianna. Neither answer made me feel better. I called Luke that afternoon. He answered on the 5th ring. "What?" "I need one question answered. If this is about coming back, I already told you." "It's not." Silence. "Did Brianna ever read the original succession agreement?" He didn't respond immediately. Then he sighed. "Yes." "All of it?" "I don't know." "You gave it to her." "She's my wife." "You keep saying that like marriage erases confidentiality." Luke's voice sharpened. "She wanted to understand what my future looked like." "And did she show it to Charles?" "No." "You sure?" "Yes." Too fast. I let the silence sit between us. Finally he said, "She may have talked to him about parts of it. Parts like the 72-hour approval clause." Another pause. "I don't remember." That meant yes. I had spent most of Luke's childhood recognizing his lies before he finished telling them. The problem was I had also spent most of his childhood protecting him from what happened after. This time, I wrote the answer down. 2 days later, Garrett finished reviewing Mercer Development's finances. The situation was worse than we thought. Charles had personally guaranteed portions of the failed luxury project. Several lenders had tightened his borrowing conditions. One refinancing window was approaching fast. If he doesn't secure new collateral or a strong equity partner, Garrett said, he could be forced to sell assets. How fast? Possibly within 90 days. Melissa leaned back. So he needs the Franklin project moving now. I stared at the map on the conference room wall. Our 42 acres sat beside the exact corridor Charles needed for his mixed-use development. Access road. Utility expansion. Commercial frontage. Our land didn't just add value. It made his whole project financeable. Suddenly, every strange question Brianna had asked made perfect sense. Does the company own the land? Could Luke control it? Would Helen have to sign? When would I retire? Those weren't questions about inheritance. They were due diligence. Charles had been studying my family like an acquisition target. But knowing that wasn't enough. I needed something he couldn't explain away. So I gave him something new. Melissa drafted a revised succession proposal that looked plausible but contained one condition we invented that afternoon. Any development partnership involving property-backed financing above $2 million would require a temporary reserve equal to 11% of projected infrastructure costs. There was no 11% rule at Callahan Commercial Builders. There never had been. Melissa looked at me. If Charles gets this number, we know exactly where it came from. I nodded. And nobody sees this version except Luke. The next day, I invited my son to lunch. Just him. He arrived 20 minutes late and didn't apologize. He looked tired. Angrier too. Starting a company was clearly harder than announcing one. I slid the proposal across the table. What's this? A possible path back to the succession discussion. His expression changed instantly. Not relief. Interest. You reconsidered? I said possible. He began reading. I watched him reach the new financing condition. His eyes stopped there for half a second. You added an infrastructure reserve. Yes. 11%. Yes. Why? Risk management. He nodded slowly. Then closed the document. What about Mercer Development? What about it? If Charles restructures the project, would you reconsider partnering? Maybe. Luke leaned back. I knew that look. He thought he had one. Not completely. But enough to tell Brianna. Enough to tell Charles. I let him leave with the copy. Melissa hated that part. You're giving him confidential information after we know he already mishandled it. I'm giving him information designed to be mishandled. 4 days later, Garrett called me into his office. He didn't say hello. He turned his monitor around. What am I looking at? A summary sent to one of Mercer Development's lenders. I read the paragraph twice. Charles was proposing a restructuring plan tied to a potential partnership with Callahan Commercial Builders. And there it was. An 11% infrastructure reserve. The exact condition Melissa and I had invented. The only copy outside my office had gone to Luke. I expected anger. Instead I felt almost nothing. Maybe that was the moment I finally stopped being shocked by my son. Melissa preserved the lender correspondence and documented the timeline. Now we have proof the information is moving from Luke to Mercer. Or through Brianna. Either way, Luke is the source. I knew. Still, some part of me wanted to believe he was careless rather than complicit. That part didn't survive the next conversation. I asked Luke to meet me alone at an empty job site outside Brentwood. No lawyers. No Charles. No Brianna. Just us. I handed him the lender document. He read the 11% language. Then looked at me. You set me up. I tested you. You lied to me. I gave you one confidential proposal. You knew I'd show Charles. No. I looked him in the eye. I hoped you wouldn't. His face hardened. Then he said something I never expected. I sent it to him myself. I didn't speak. Luke folded the paper. You keep acting like Brianna and Charles are tricking me. Aren't they? No. He laughed bitterly. Charles is helping me build something that's mine. With your father's clients. They came to me. With Mercer financing. So. With information from my company. Your company. The way he said it was the real accusation. Your company. Not ours. Not someday mine. Yours. He stepped closer. You made me vice president, but every major decision still came through you. Every client knew you could overrule me. Every bank knew I needed your approval. I was trying to prepare you. You were keeping me underneath you. I wanted to tell him how many mistakes I had covered. How many contracts I had corrected before he saw the damage. How many times I protected his reputation inside our own boardroom. But for once, I stopped myself. Maybe that had been the problem. I had erased so many consequences that Luke thought there had never been mistakes. Charles respects me, he said. No. Charles needs you. You can't stand that someone else believes in me. I looked at my son and realized he wasn't merely being manipulated. He was participating because the manipulation told him what he wanted to hear. You knew Brianna showed Charles the succession agreement. His jaw moved. You knew, didn't you? She talks to her father. That isn't an answer. Luke shoved the lender document back into my chest. I'm done explaining myself. He walked away. I let him. That evening, Brianna sent Helen a message. No apology. No kindness. Just 4 photographs from the wedding. In the first, Helen was standing close to Brianna near the garden doors. In the second, Helen's finger was raised. In the third, Brianna had stepped backward. And in the fourth, Helen looked furious. Below them, Brianna wrote. Maybe you should remember how you were behaving before you accuse me of attacking you. Helen stared at the images. I was confronting her. I know. But this makes it look like. I know. The photos were good. Not fake. Just incomplete. Exactly the kind of truth Charles liked best. A piece of reality arranged to make a lie believable. Luke called 15 minutes later. You saw the pictures? Yes. Mom went after Brianna. She confronted her after overhearing her talking to Charles. That's her story. Helen flinched. I looked at her. Then I said something I should have said months earlier. Luke, I'm not asking you to choose between your wife and your mother. Good. I'm choosing. Silence. I'm protecting your mother. His voice dropped. What does that mean? It means I'm done trying to convince you. I ended the call. 3 days later, the quarterly ownership meeting arrived. Charles had been invited to present his development partnership. He thought that meant I was ready to surrender. Luke thought I was frightened by his resignation. Brianna thought the wedding photographs had neutralized Helen. Melissa had the original agreements. Garrett had Mercer's financial records. I had the planted 11% condition. And Helen had agreed to attend. Before we entered the boardroom, she touched my arm. What if this costs you, Luke? I looked through the glass wall. My son was already sitting beside Charles. For most of my life, that question would have stopped me. That morning, it didn't. If telling the truth costs me my son, I said, then keeping him would require a lie. Melissa opened the boardroom door. Charles stood with a smile. I walked inside and took my seat at the head of the table. For the first time, I wasn't there to save Luke. I was there to make sure Charles Mercer never touched my wife's land, my company, or another piece of my family's future. And Charles still had no idea that almost every document on the table had been placed there to trap him. Charles Mercer walked into my boardroom carrying a leather portfolio and the confidence of a man who believed the hardest part was already over. Luke sat beside him. Brianna took the chair on Luke's other side. Helen sat across from them, quiet, composed, wearing a simple navy blouse and the single pearl earring she still had. Charles noticed it. His eyes stayed on her ear a fraction longer than they should have. Then he smiled at me. Robert. I'm glad we're finally approaching this like businessmen. I returned the smile. We should have done that from the beginning. That seemed to please him. Melissa sat to my right with 3 folders stacked neatly in front of her. Garrett had a laptop open beside her. 2 independent board members were present, along with our outside accountant. Charles assumed the audience was there to witness my surrender. He stood and began his presentation. He was good. I'll give him that. The Mercer-Callahan partnership, according to him, would create one of the strongest mixed-use developments in Middle Tennessee. He talked about retail anchors, multifamily housing, medical offices, road access, and projected returns. Then he showed a map. My 42 acres outside Franklin were shaded in green. I leaned forward. You included my property. Charles didn't hesitate. As a potential contribution. I never agreed to contribute it. Of course not. We're discussing possibilities. Luke spoke. Dad, the property makes the project work. I know. He seemed surprised by that answer. Charles clicked to his next slide. What we're proposing gives Luke immediate leadership responsibility while allowing you a graceful transition into retirement. Graceful. That was the kind of word people used when they wanted you to surrender without admitting you had surrendered. I let him finish. 27 minutes. No interruptions. When Charles sat down, he looked almost disappointed that I hadn't argued. I turned to Melissa. Anything you want clarified? She opened the first folder. Yes. Charles smiled. Of course. Melissa looked directly at him. Mr. Mercer, when did you first receive details regarding Callahan Commercial Builders' 11% infrastructure reserve requirement? The smile changed slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. She slid a document across the table. A financing summary submitted to one of your lenders references an 11% reserve on infrastructure costs. Charles glanced at Luke. Luke looked at me. That came from me, he said. I know, I replied. Luke stiffened. Melissa continued. When did you give it to Mr. Mercer? After Dad gave me the revised succession proposal. Charles relaxed. There. A clean explanation. Exactly the one we expected. I nodded. Good. So Charles learned about the 11% condition through Luke. Yes, Charles said. Absolutely. Fine. I leaned back. Then let's talk about the 72-hour clause. Nobody moved. Charles's expression didn't collapse. He was too experienced for that. But he stopped blinking. I continued. You mentioned it to me at lunch in June. I don't recall that. I do. Robert, we've had many business conversations. Not about that clause. Melissa opened the second folder. The 72-hour provision appeared only in Robert's confidential succession draft. It was never distributed to Mercer Development. Charles folded his hands. Then Luke must have mentioned it. Luke looked at him. I didn't. It was the first time that morning my son sounded uncertain. Charles turned slightly. You may not remember. I remember. Brianna shifted in her chair. I watched her. That tiny movement told me she knew where this was going. Melissa placed two versions of the succession agreement on the table. The first is Robert's original draft. The second is the version Luke presented after the wedding. She highlighted the altered paragraph. This language expands property-backed financing authority. It did not originate with Robert, me, or the CFO. Charles shrugged. Families revise agreements all the time. Correct, Melissa said. But outsiders generally don't know confidential provisions from the earlier version before those revisions occur. His smile disappeared. Luke turned to Brianna. Did you show him the draft? She looked offended. I may have discussed it with my father. That's not what he asked, Helen said. Brianna's head snapped toward her. Helen didn't raise her voice. Did you give Charles the document? Brianna laughed once. Are we really doing this again? Yes, I said. We are. She looked at Luke. This is your father trying to humiliate us. Charles interrupted. This is getting personal. No, I said. The wedding was personal. This is business. Garrett rotated his laptop so everyone could see the screen. Mercer Development is under significant financial pressure. Charles's face hardened. That's confidential. Much of this is public financing information. Garrett walked through the lender notices, missed milestones, guarantees, and upcoming refinancing pressure. Charles remained composed until Garrett reached the Franklin project. Based on the structure we reviewed, the Mercer development becomes dramatically easier to finance if the Callahan property is contributed or pledged. Luke looked at Charles. You told me the project was already funded. Charles didn't answer immediately. It was substantially arranged. That's not what he said, Luke muttered. I watched my son carefully. A few months earlier, I would have felt hope. I would have thought, he's finally seeing it. I didn't let myself do that anymore. Seeing the truth wasn't the same as accepting responsibility. Melissa slid another page forward. Now we have the altered succession provision, the confidential 72-hour clause, the Franklin land, and a documented need for stronger collateral. Charles exhaled. Circumstantial. Some of it, I said. Then I looked at Luke. Tell them about the 11% condition. His eyes narrowed. What about it? It didn't exist. Silence. Brianna frowned. Charles looked at me for the first time with genuine alarm. I continued. Melissa and I created it. Luke stared at me. You set me up. Yes. Charles interrupted. That proves nothing. It proves information given only to Luke appeared in your lender proposal within days. Luke looked down. I said, he already admitted he sent it to you. Charles leaned back. Then there's no mystery. No mystery at all. I opened the final folder. The mystery is how you knew confidential information before Luke admits giving you anything. Charles's patience finally cracked. You're making a tremendous mistake. Maybe. You think because you poured concrete for 40 years you understand complex development financing? Melissa looked down, hiding the smallest smile. Charles continued. You're sitting on land that could multiply in value, but you refuse to move because you're emotionally attached to control. There it was. The contempt. Not hidden anymore. Luke stared at him. Charles. But Charles wasn't finished. You drafted a succession structure with a 72-hour approval window, layered voting thresholds, property restrictions, and financing controls, then act offended because people tried to work within it. The room became completely still. Charles stopped. Too late. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Melissa spoke softly. Mr. Mercer, nobody in this meeting described the layered voting thresholds. His face changed. She continued. And the version circulated to Luke last week did not contain the original property restrictions you just referenced. Luke looked at Charles. Then at Brianna. Dad never told you that. Charles said nothing. Brianna jumped in. He's twisting your words. Helen shook her head. No. For the first time, Luke looked directly at his wife with suspicion instead of defense. Did you give him the original document? Brianna's eyes filled instantly. It was impressive. I was trying to help you. That was not a denial. Luke heard it too. His face went pale. You gave it to him. Your father was never going to let you run anything. That wasn't your decision. I was protecting our future. Charles snapped, Brianna, enough. Luke turned toward him. You knew Dad's succession plan before the wedding. Charles said nothing. You knew about the land. Still nothing. You knew how much voting control I'd get. Charles finally lost his temper. Yes, because somebody had to think strategically. Luke stared at him. I thought you were backing my company. I was. No. You were backing access to his assets. Charles pushed back from the table. Don't become sentimental now. My son's expression hardened. Charles pointed toward me. Without my financing, you are still just your father's employee. That sentence did what none of my evidence could. It stripped away the illusion. Luke sat frozen. For months, Charles had told him he was brilliant. Independent. Undervalued. A future leader. Now that Luke was no longer useful, Charles told him exactly what he thought of him. Nothing. A signature. A last name. A door into my company. Brianna whispered, Dad. Charles ignored her. I stood. This meeting is over. He laughed. You can't be serious. I'm withdrawing the succession transfer. Luke looked at me sharply. I continued. Callahan Commercial Builders will not enter any partnership with Mercer Development. The Franklin property will remain personally owned by Helen and me. Charles's face darkened. You'll regret this. No. I looked around the table. I would have regretted signing. He grabbed his portfolio and walked out. Brianna followed after him. Luke remained seated. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then he looked at Helen. Mom. She stood. Not today. He flinched. I didn't save him from that either. The business side collapsed quickly after that. Without our participation, Charles's Franklin project lost the asset support he had been depending on. A lender paused negotiations. 2 potential partners backed away once his financing pressure became obvious. I didn't destroy Mercer Development. Charles had already done most of that himself. I just refused to let him use my company as a lifeboat. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. 6 days later, Helen received a call from Ashford Ridge Estate. A maintenance crew had found her missing pearl earring. She put the call on speaker. The venue manager said, "We found it lodged under the wooden edge beside the garden walkway." Helen frowned. Beside the walkway? Yes, ma'am. Not in the flower bed. I looked at her. She looked at me. We drove there that afternoon. A staff member showed us the exact spot. The earring had been trapped several feet before the place where Helen landed in the mud. Helen stared at it in my palm. That doesn't make sense. Then her hand rose slowly to the spot behind her ear. The red mark. The one the medic had assumed came from the fall. Her face changed. She grabbed me. What? Brianna. Helen closed her eyes. She grabbed the back of my dress. My hair too. I remember my head jerking. That was why the earring had come loose before Helen left the walkway. We contacted the wedding photographer. He still had the raw images. One photograph, taken seconds before the fall, showed Helen wearing both pearls. Brianna was directly behind her. The venue's first aid report documented the mark behind Helen's ear. The earring's location didn't prove the business scheme. It didn't need to. It proved something more important to Helen. She hadn't slipped. She hadn't imagined being grabbed. And she hadn't ruined her son's wedding by telling the truth. When we showed Luke, he stared at the photograph for a long time. He didn't defend Brianna. Not this time. 2 weeks later, he came to my office alone. I want to come back. I looked at him across the same desk where I had signed his first promotion. No. His face fell. Dad. Not now. I made mistakes. You made decisions. I know. Then live with them. He looked angry. Then ashamed. What am I supposed to do? For most of his life, that question would have made me reach for my checkbook. Instead, I said, figure it out. His marriage to Brianna began unraveling after that. I stayed out of it. He had clients to answer to. Contracts he had promised. Debts connected to the company he tried to launch. And a mother he still owed more than an apology. For once, I let my adult son carry the weight of his own choices. 3 months later, Helen asked me to drive back to Ashford Ridge. I didn't understand why until we reached the garden. The path had been repaired. The flower bed was dry. Helen stood where she had fallen. I hated this place, she said. I know. I don't want to anymore. So we walked. Slowly. Past the spot where Brianna had shoved her. Past the wooden edge where the pearl had been found. For years, I thought protecting my family meant stepping in front of every problem. Paying every bill. Fixing every mistake. Removing every consequence before it could hurt Luke. But sometimes protection looks different. Sometimes it means standing beside the person who told the truth. Sometimes it means closing the door on the person trying to use you. And sometimes, when your child makes a choice that breaks your heart, the most loving thing you can do is refuse to rescue him from it. Helen slipped her hand into mine. This time, I didn't walk ahead checking the path for puddles. I walked beside her. And that was enough.